Hey, everybody, welcome to the channel. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we're going to be talking about our Avengers campaign, which is one of the current campaigns we're running. This is actually the very first adventure for that campaign. We're going to do a little bit of quick recap history for the game world for new listeners. We're going to be talking about Ultron and the Age of Ultron. And then I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the art of Simon Stalenhag. He inspired a role playing game called Tales from the Loop, which was then made into a show for Amazon of the same name. And some of the struggles we've had. We love his art. It's hard to incorporate it into a game, though. I'm going to be talking about that there at the end. But at any rate, before we get into all of that, as always, we would love it if you were to smash the like button, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. That helps us out with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love hearing from you guys. We have an awesome community here, and it's all thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, having said all that, let's get into it. So, this will be a real quick recap for anybody who this might be their first encounter with my channel. Our game world has Marvel and DC characters coexisting. We use real time rather than comic book time. So that means that for us, the Avengers debuted in the 1960s. And in around the year 1970, it varies from person to person. That's when most of them would have gotten married. And then in the mid 70s is when they would start to have kids. So, an example of that would be in the 1960s, the original Ant-Man, aka Hank Pym, was adventuring with the original Wasp, aka Janet Van Dyne. And then they were married around 1970. And then in the mid 70s, they had a daughter named Hope. And we take that from the Marvel movies. And so that means that in real life, my approach to this is that most of the Marvel heroes would be about the same age that my parents would be. Most of their kids would be about the same age that I am. And then most of their kids would be the same age as my kids, right? So our story is a generational legacy story. So the when I say, this is the first Avengers story of the current era, I'm talking about the grandchildren of the originals. So the new Ant-Man and Wasp, their names are Hank and Jan, but they were named after their grandparents and their mom is Hope. Does that make sense? As always, if I say something and it doesn't make sense to you, don't hesitate to ask me a question in the comments section. When I run a role-playing game on a Saturday afternoon here in my living room at my house, it's a two-way street. I'm talking to my players. I'm able to look at their face and just gauge their understanding based on body language. They can ask me questions back, so on and so forth. I've always found it to be a lot harder for me to express myself when it's a one-way thing like YouTube. So yeah, if you need anything cleared up ever, just ask me in the comments, and I'll be happy to try to do a better job on my end of making things understandable. So, okay, so that's the Avengers. And then our Avengers roster for this first game was we threw Captain America in there, who is Steve Rogers the second. His mom, by the way, is American Dream. She comes from the Spider-Girl comics. In our game world, her parents, American Dream's parents, were Steve Rogers, and he had married Sharon Carter. And I feel like the Peggy Carter thing was more of kind of an MCU thing, and this, predates all that. But the original Steve Rogers and Sharon Carter would have been working together again back in like the 60s. They were both agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. for a while, stuff like that, right? Um, let's see, who else should I mention? Um, well, the other members of the team then are, I already mentioned Ant-Man and Wasp. So Iron Man, Hulk, and Thor. And they are all named after their grandparents. So that was it. That was the whole roster of the team there. And then the villain for this first adventure was Ultron. And he is, I wouldn't call him like the grandson of the original Ultron or whatever. Really, he is Ultron. He's the real deal. And the way that works in our game world is the Avengers would fight Ultron and destroy him. And so then a new robot would be built, but it had the same mind, right? And so then the new robot would be like Ultron 2, and then they'd break that, and then they would later encounter Ultron 3 and Ultron 4, and you know what I mean? So we've lost count at this point at how many Ultrons there are, but we say there are these factories hidden around the world, and they have the ability to detect when the current Ultron is destroyed. And when he is, they get to work building the new Ultron. And so we had this big event called Blackest Night where a bunch of characters died, and Ultron didn't make it through that. So this is now the first time we're seeing an Ultron after that event took place. So we ripped off the film Avengers Age of Ultron, where he goes to Europe and he's going to do what Gundam, I think, would call a colony drop, right? He's going to lift an entire city into the sky and then drop it on the earth, doing tons of damage, hoping to cause an extinction level event for the humans so that then he can sort of turn Earth into a machine world, so on and so forth. We just tried to do that verbatim. We gave him an army of robots at his command. So the way we treated it was we used the stats from the old Marvel superheroes role-playing game by TSR that was made in the 80s. So our primary Ultron, Ultron Prime or whatever you want to call him, those are the stats that he had. And then we would take it down. We kind of had a pecking order, almost like military rank. And so then he had two guys that served him, and we just took all of those stats and we dropped it one column shift. And then each one of those guys had guys under them, and then again we drop it another column. And so then we had street level Ultrons that were much easier to defeat. So characters like Wasp, who was kind of the weakest of everybody, in this adventure, she was able to take out sort of those foot soldiers. Then the heavy hitters like Hulk and Thor, they were the ones that did the most damage when it came to that final fight with Ultron Prime. But in terms of story, there wasn't hardly any story to this one. It really was just a beat 'em up. We used miniatures. For us, we use hero clicks, which each one is maybe like an inch tall, little plastic figurines of, Marvel and DC characters and stuff like that. And they come on like a black plastic base that's like a little bigger than a quarter. But yeah, we use those. They used to make a game called Hero Escape, which was a bunch of interlocking hexagonal plastic tiles. I loved that game actually. But when it went on clearance at Ollie's, I just bought as much of it as I could possibly afford. So I have just tons of storage totes in my basement full of Heroscape tiles. And so some of those were for like a winter scene, and they came with like ice. I don't know if you'd call them stalagmites or what, but like very cool, right? So that was sort of the setting for when we played that one. And like I said, we used the hero clicks as the miniatures for it. And yeah, that was how we played that game. And it took us the better part of a Saturday. We'd get together at noon, and around sunset is kind of when everybody wants to go home. This one lasted longer than that. So we played until maybe 9 or 10 o'clock on Saturday night, eating pizza, drinking Mountain Dew, and stuff like that. So, so the last component of this one then that I wanted to mention is Simon Stalenhag. For people who've been following my channel the whole time, you've heard me mention probably ad nauseum that my day job is I'm an art teacher. I went to art school, yada, 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 right? So, like, I love art. I'm a big art guy. And in the modern era, I can't think of anybody that I like more than Simon Stalenhag. I feel like this guy just knocks it out of the park. If you haven't ever seen his art, Google it. Uh, I am extremely impressed with it. I personally never get tired of looking at it. And not only is he technically proficient, as a painter, but he evokes this emotion. And I think it's really interesting that it's really hard to put it into words. And it's complicated. And it's something in the general ballpark of nostalgia, but I would argue that that's not quite it. And because it's so nebulous and hard to pin down, I don't think anybody like, first of all, this hit big around, I don't know if it was 2015, give or take a few years, but at any rate, when it hit, I felt like I was seeing his art everywhere, and like everybody seemed to love it. I, to this day, have never encountered anybody that looked at his art and was just like, that sucks. I feel like everybody loves it, and it's like a mood thing, it's an emotion thing. But then when you try to put it into words, it's really hard to do. And so then the problem with that is, like, for instance, right after his art hit the internet, was like making the rounds on Facebook and all that good stuff, they did, I want to say it was a Kickstarter for a role-playing game based on his artwork, and that was called Tales from the Loop. And I was so excited about it. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. Let's do this. Like, I want to play this game. And it's very rare for me to want to play a role-playing game other than my superhero game, but I wanted to. And so I remember the first time I was finally able to download the PDF, because I think I backed it or whatever, and then I got an email and it's like, hey, yada yada yada, you can download your thing now. And I did. And I remember reading through it and being disappointed. And, like, I remember this one paragraph, for whatever reason, sticks out in my mind. And it was explaining for people younger than myself, people who are maybe like the age of my own kids. It was just trying to explain what it was like to grow up in the 80s. And it was this whole section about like Blockbuster Video and how we used to have to go to the video store and pick out a physical, like a VCR tape, to take it home and to watch this movie. And so I remember this whole section of the game just talking about VCR tapes and like explaining what it is for anyone who didn't know what one was, but then like trying to explain how it made us feel, or like what is cool about a VCR tape in the writer's opinion that later media doesn't capture that mood, right? And the thing that struck me with all of that was, first of all, I don't know if younger players could possibly feel nostalgic for my childhood when that is not the era when they were kids, right? I don't know about that. Maybe that'd be a good thing for you to put in the comments section. Let me know what you think of that, of being nostalgic for somebody else's childhood. But I felt like there was kind of a disconnect there. And then the other thing is, role-playing games are a very verbal thing. it's somebody trying to describe a thing to you. You have to generate the images in your head. And I've just noticed with my own players, I feel like that's only about 50-50 with players, where a lot of them, they don't have any images in their head at all. And like I am the opposite. And like when someone runs a game for me, something I frequently do is I'll say, I'm not trying to be a punk or anything, but can you give me some more adjectives? Like I'm having a hard time imagining what you're describing. Just load it down with adjectives. Like I want to see a movie in my head about what we're doing right now, right? But then I'll have players where I'm trying to kind of put a movie into their head and they get nothing, you know? And and so first of all, even if you were to somehow sum up the complexity of Simon Stålenhag's art through words, which I'm not sold on the fact you even could. But let's say for the sake of argument that you could, right? I don't know if that's going to land right. I don't know if the player is going to experience that emotion you're trying to get him to feel, right? And then what I think is the more realistic thing there is that's not going to happen. You're not going to find the words probably. So that's another level of disconnect. And for something that is just a a visual thing, and I think it's almost like an instinctive gut reaction to a thing, it's not a story. And so then the problem is with a role-playing game, it's a story, right? And so then you're trying to make a story out of something that was never really a story to begin with. It was just a mood. And then you do the same with the Amazon show when they made the Tales from the Loop show. So all that said, this was my first attempt to import Simon Stålenhag into our game. And I felt like, I had kind of a checklist. So a lot of his art, because where he grew up in real life, which I believe was Stockholm, Sweden. I've heard him talk about the winters there, his proximity to things like the Arctic Circle and stuff like that. And so, for instance, winter for him was a whole other animal than winter is for me growing up where I grew up. So I thought that was kind of a component of what he was doing with a lot of these visuals. So I set our thing in the winter. I made a point of having it be snowy. Um, something he does in his art a lot is there'll be these weird big towers in the distance that serve some sort of a high-tech purpose that is never really defined. And so I just said the same thing. And I was like, you know what? That makes sense to me. We are in this game world with guys like Tony Stark and Bruce Wayne who have, of course, they would have had an effect on the technology level of the game world, right? We see guys now like, say, Elon Musk. Elon Musk, is doing all sorts of tech stuff right now that is having an impact on the world we live in, right? I feel like in a way, that's kind of like what a Tony Stark would have been doing back in the 60s. So I was totally cool with having these weird, big, high-tech towers off in the distance, and like you don't really even know what they're for. And it kind of didn't matter, but just I thought that having those sorts of things in the landscape was kind of a cool idea. But you get the idea, right? I had this checklist of all the stuff of like I'm gonna try to describe all of these things so that we're in the fictional country of Sokovia. I'm really, really trying to like make this particular adventure my Tales from the Loop adventure. And it just didn't work. Like I say, I wouldn't quite call the mood nostalgia, but I don't have a word for what his images evoke, right? So I'll just say nostalgia instead. Like when we were playing it, nobody felt nostalgia. You know what I mean? It just didn't come across, I mean. But yeah, Now that said, it's not like it bothered anybody. I think they were probably just confused on their end why I kept talking about things like the landscape, you know, stuff that I just normally don't talk about. Um, but it was by no means an unfun game. It landed like any other beat 'em up, you know. They were having fun. Players were telling jokes every round, stuff like that. There's always junk food involved. There's My games are almost always lots of junk food and laughing and stuff like that. So it was a fun game. It didn't work on the level that I had hoped it would. And then the other thing was we tried this again when I was going through the timeline. I should have mentioned this in the 80s. I had said that since the Sentinels from Marvel were around in the 1960s, that there were occasionally out in the middle of nowhere in America, like a Sentinel would get shot over like a farm or something, and it was too jacked up where like nobody wanted to go recover it and do anything with it. Um, and so by the 80s or 90s, we had a lot of these characters that were young teenage superheroes who were growing up in a rural area, right? And so they were growing up kind of like in a Smallville kind of a setting, and they would have to use their various travel powers, whether it was flight or teleportation or super speed or whatever, to go to a town to go have the adventure in that town. But after the adventure's over, they went back out in the countryside. And I did retroactively do some games where they would be like sitting around on like the remains of a sentinel in like the middle of a wheat field or something. And it would be rusty from, being out in the elements for, 20 or 30 years. And it would maybe have like moss and stuff like that growing on it. Again, I was really trying to get a certain emotion across, and it just didn't work. I feel like maybe if it was a live action movie and we could actually build a real, you know, a rusting hulk of an old Sentinel and do like they did with Lord of the Rings, where you build the prop out in a field a couple years before you start filming the movie and actually let real moss grow on it and stuff. Like that might be cool, but yeah, I don't know. The way we did it, it just again it didn't land. But that's just me. Uh if you guys have ever played a game like Tales from the Loop or tried to do something with the Stalinhog art, I would be really curious to hear about that. So that would be a great thing for you to put in the comments section of this one. If not that, maybe you've just seen the art, you have an opinion on it, you like it, you hate it, whatever. Tell me about that too, that'd be cool. But I think that's it for this one. I can't really think of anything to add, and I've been more long-winded than I wanted to be. But hopefully you enjoyed this. If so, as always, we'd love it if you smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and yeah, leave that comment. I'd be very curious to hear from you guys. And from everybody here associated with the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you guys have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.